Excited to be with you guys. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cover a lot of information on what a 1031 is all about, why it's such a powerful tool. This is the first disclaimer. For your own specific tax advice, see your tax advisor. Rebecca, if you go to the next slide, that'd be great. Let's get into today's topic. And something that's been in the tax code, believe it or not now, for over 100 years is something called the 1031 exchange. And what that allows is anybody to sell any property that's been held for investment purposes or used in a business, defer capital gain taxes, and reinvest in another like-kind property. This is the strategy that real estate investors use to build wealth. Whether you're starting with land or one single family and you want to grow in that space, whether you want to grow into commercial, this is the way people build. Okay, go on to the next slide there, Rebecca. So in an exchange, taxable sale, you just take a property, you give it up, you get back money. In a 1031 exchange, you take a property held for investment, you give it up, and you get back like-kind property. So taxable sale, property for cash, 1031 exchange, property for property. So let's go to the next slide. And there are a whole bunch of different provisions where you can defer taxes. And I'm not going to go through all of these. Section 1031 comes from the tax code. That's why it's called a 1031 exchange. And it allows you to exchange one property held for investment for another. There are some other provisions that are there. What I'm going to do, if you go to the next slide, Rebecca, I want to give you some of the terminology because you're going to hear these buzzwords. And I just want to give you a very simple definition. My goal is to equip you as real estate investors, real estate professionals, anybody involved in exchange to know the basics of the process. So let me walk through a few basic terms. Actual receipt is when you actually receive the money. Now, the second bullet point is something you'll hear a lot, boot. The simple definition of boot is simply non-like-kind property. And we have two different types of boot. You can have cash boot, that's money you receive, or you can have mortgage boot, which is a reduction in your mortgage liability. So if you give up a mortgage of $100,000 but only have a mortgage of $80,000, that's $20,000 of what we call mortgage boot, and both of those are taxable. Constructive receipt is when you're entitled to the proceeds in some manner. And here's what happens. This comes up a lot where somebody maybe closes on a Friday, they leave the money at the title company, even though they haven't taken the possession of the money, still have constructive receipt, and that means you now cannot do a 1031 exchange. Direct deeding is the direct transfer of title from the investor to the buyer or from the seller back to the investor. You're going to help me refer to the investor as maybe an exchanger or a taxpayer. The exchange agreement is a document prepared by a qualified intermediary that outlines how the money and the transaction will be structured. Now, the exchange period is a maximum of 180 days. It can be less, and under one exception, it can be more. But think of it generally as 180 calendar days. The identification period is a 45-day period from when you close that you have to identify property. Like-kind property is simply any property held for investment. It could be bare land. It could be anything that you hold for investment. So don't think you've got to go land for land, single family for single family. Anything you hold for investment, whether it's residential, commercial, or land, can qualify for an exchange. The party in the middle of an exchange is called a qualified intermediary, sometimes referred to as a QI. They can also be called a facilitator, an accommodator, or an intermediary. And then finally, the property given up is called the relinquished property. Sometimes you'll hear it called the sale property. The property being purchased is called the replacement property, sometimes called the purchase property, phase 2 property, or upleg. So go to the next slide, Rebecca. The reason why we do an exchange is that when you sell in a taxable sale, you have potentially 4 different levels of taxes. All the depreciation recapture is taxed at 25%. So if you've owned a property for 20 years, you'd have to recapture all that at a higher tax rate. The remaining federal gain is taxed at either 15 or 20%, depending upon your income. Many investors face this net investment income tax, which is an additional 3.8% tax on any net investment income, which capital gain is considered net investment income, over 200,000 for single filers, over 250,000 for married filing jointly. And then finally, you've got state taxes. So whatever state you're in, you're going to have a state tax. Most states have a state tax, some don't. The highest is in California, which is 13.3%. Go ahead and advance the next slide there, Rebecca. You'll see there are a lot of reasons to do an exchange. Tax deferral is one, but what about leverage? You know, some investors have a lot of equity in their property, and it feels good to have a lot of equity. It may not be providing the best return on investment, the best ROI. So take a property where you've got a lot of equity, redeploy it into multiple properties or one larger property by adding some financing. Cash flow. You know, a lot of investors own dirt. They go out of that with the equity and they go into an improved property that provides cash flow. You can also diversify. And I'll tell you, a market like Charlotte is benefiting. So many people are coming into your marketplace out of states like California, the West Coast, New York, New Jersey. So diversifying and maybe having assets in a couple of marketplaces might be a good play, because you don't know what market's going to perform well over the next 15 to 20 years. Sometimes people consolidate with an exchange, multiple single families, and they'll exchange them into one apartment complex. A lot of different things you can accomplish. On the next slide, if you could advance it, Rebecca, you'll see when you sell, when you buy a property, you really have three options. You can be a buy and hold investor. The only thing that I'll suggest there is that you're a buy and hold investor and you're in a part of the economy where there's not a lot of job growth, not a lot of appreciation, it might make sense to exchange out of that market and go into a market that's growing. Second, you can sell and pay all the taxes. So those four taxes we just discussed, if you do that, you're just going to have the after-tax equity, what I call the net equity after taxes, to redeploy. When you do an exchange, you have all of the gross equity available to you. So you're able to get a better return on investment. And then third option, you can do a 1031 exchange. And keep in mind, you can do a fully deferred exchange where you defer all taxes, or you can do a partially deferred taxes exchange. About a third of our clients get partial deferral. So don't think of it as an all or nothing proposition. If you can advance the next slide, here's the actual code itself. It says no gain or loss shall be recognized on the exchange of real property held for productive use in a trade or business or for investment, if such real property is exchanged solely for real property of like kind, which is to be held either for productive use in a trade or business or for investment. So sometimes we'll hear people refer to these as a tax-free exchange. They're not. It's a tax-deferred. Now, you can do an exchange over and over and over and over again and pass away and pass on that highly appreciated property to your heirs with a step up in basis. So I own real estate. I will never sell my properties. I'll continually exchange them over and over again. I might change the nature of my investments. So I'm big into single family, and I might move into commercial or other types of asset classes. But it's a powerful strategy. So as long as you go from any property either held for investment or used in a business for any other property held the same way, they're considered like kind and it qualifies. Go ahead and advance the next slide. There's some things you cannot exchange. Stock and trade or other property held primarily for sale. So those of you doing maybe a fix and flip, that is excluded. You can't do a 1031 exchange on a fix and flip because you're holding it for sale. So you have to hold it for long-term investment. And then I want to draw your attention down to the fourth bullet point. Any entity can do an exchange. So you as an individual can exchange. An LLC can, a trust can, a C Corp and S Corp. But what you cannot exchange is a partnership interest. You can't go out of a partnership interest or into it. They're excluded. And so we'll look at this in just a moment of what that entails in that particular realm. If you can advance the next slide. I'm not going to go through all these, but this is a list of things that the IRS will look at to determine, are you holding for sale or are you holding for long-term investment? And I bet some of you right now at this point are asking yourself the question, or you want to ask me, well, I got a question for you, Scott. How long do I need to hold a property before it's held for investment? What's the time period? And you're going to find out in just a few slides there is no time period. There's no mandatory 1 year or a year and a day or 2 years. It all comes down to your intent to hold for investment. So personally, I think that provides planning opportunities for savvy investors because you don't have a mandatory time period. Go ahead and advance it from there. I want to dig a little bit into this partnership thing. I'm assuming as investors in Charlotte, many of you own property in LLCs and in partnerships, right? You've gone in with other people. The whole partnership can do an exchange and buy a new property. But sometimes in a partnership, some people want to get out and others want to keep exchanging and rolling it over. So there are some planning opportunities, but you have to get it. Your interest in that partnership doesn't qualify because you own an interest in an entity. The partnership owns real property. You just have a personal property interest in an entity that owns real property. So advance to the next slide. You've got to get it out of there. And the way this is commonly done is what's called a drop and swap or a swap and drop. The most common format is you drop out. The partnership deeds out to the various investors. Then when it goes to be sold, the investors that want to sell do it for cash. The ones that want to exchange go their separate ways. So you're really electing no longer to be treated as a partnership. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. The key issue is that earlier you do this, the better. If you do it too close to closing, you're at more risk. And if you advance to the next slide there, Rebecca. I won't go into all the legal mumbo jumbo, but in Charlotte, you're in much better shape. If you're in California or you have an investor selling in California, the state tax board, the FTB, has taken a very aggressive position saying they're going to go after these. So the tax law is fairly favorable, but just realize there's a little bit of risk in doing these. I'd be happy to explain this. This is something where you're going to want to get your tax advisor involved, get their input, and get their guidance on doing these. But I wanted to mention that because so many investors hold title in partnerships and LLCs. This is just a really common scenario. And by the way, as I'm going here, I will have Q&A at the end. So if you've got questions, hold them. I look forward to answering everybody's questions. Go ahead and move on to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back. You're on it. This is just a general principle. The tax owner that owns the property selling it should be the same tax owner that buys it. So if you sell in your name, you should keep that the same. But why I say tax owner is I can form a new single member LLC that's disregarded for federal tax purposes. And that's still the same tax owner. So I sell in my name as Scott Saunders. I go into Scott Saunders LLC. Where things get a little tricky is when people maybe remarry and they bring in separate assets. So you'll see the first bullet point, the wife owns a property as her own property, but now she's remarried, she wants her husband on title. The better way to do it is just have the wife sell and the wife purchase. Maybe later on quitclaim and add the husband down the road. So these are just kind of general principles. Again, you'd want to review this with your qualified intermediary and tax professional. You can skip the next slide. Go ahead and advance past that one. Be careful with related parties. What I want to get into are the types of properties that qualify. When you look at this slide, you see a cabin on a river, right? A mountain home, which can qualify, a vacation home, commercial, residential, farm, Airbnb, you name it, right? So you've got a lot of beachfront properties out there. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you've got properties that look something kind of like that. Those can qualify, and I'm going to share with you in a moment how. So like kind is very, very broad. I'm going to share things with you probably never even thought of could be 1031 properties. So go to the next screen, Rebecca. The easiest way to remember this is what doesn't qualify for an exchange. Number one, your home you live in, your primary residence, because you live in it. Now, I'm going to talk about your primary residence near the end and some great planning opportunities with different things. The other type is property held for sale, dealer property, fix and flip property. Other than that, as long as it's real estate, so I call it real property, real estate, you can do an exchange for any real estate held for investment for any other. It doesn't need to be land for land. So if you look at the third bullet point, things that qualify, bare land, commercial, single-family rentals, multifamily, office, industrial, easements, air rights, water rights, a vacation home held for investment, even something called fractional ownership. So I'm going to go through fairly quickly a few things that maybe you hadn't even thought of as being like-kind property to show you just how broad it is. So go to the next slide. We can do exchange on air, literally what's called an air right or a transferable development right. If I'm in New York City and I have a 20-story hotel and I have the right to add 5 stories, that is considered real property, and I can exchange that for any other real property. Go to the next one there. Easements of any type qualify, so agricultural easements, conservation easements, and this one here, a perpetual communication easement, which is a cell tower. So a lot of unique things. Go to the next one. Here's one you probably have never thought of. Oil, gas, and mineral rights qualify. We have a lot of people now looking at the price of energy and thinking that's a good long-term play. As long as it's a royalty interest, we have the right to extract all the oil, gas, or minerals. It qualifies for an exchange. A production payment does. So that might have there. Now let me go to the next one, which I think comes up a lot. Outside of Charlotte, you've got vacation properties. In fact, I just flew through Charlotte. Love your airport. Love those little rocking chairs. And I was flying down to St. Lucia, and we got delayed because where I was flying, there was a tropical storm. And I got talking to some of the local people in the airport, and they were talking about vacation properties. So let me kind of give you the run through on this, because I think, you think of all the Airbnb properties and those types of assets, you have a lot of those around your marketplace. If it's a pure second home, vacation home, never rented out, just personal use, it does not qualify. If it's a vacation home that is held for investment and meets these requirements, it can qualify. So back in 2008, the IRS came out with this guidance. And an easy way to remember this is the rule of 2s. You have to hold it for 2 years. You have to rent it out for 2 weeks in each year. And your personal use cannot exceed 2 weeks or 10% of the time it's rented. If you do that, it qualifies as a property held for investment. And you can even rent it to family members as long as it's a fair market rent. The only caution I would make to everybody here is when it says 2 weeks, the IRS means 2 weeks. The question I get in almost every class is, well, how is the IRS going to know if I stayed there 4 weeks instead of 2? And I'll tell you how they know. They have powers to subpoena your cell phone records to see where you were connecting. They can see where you logged into the internet. They will pull up your credit card statements to see, you said you were in Charlotte, but you were down at the Outer Banks, right? And that's where you're buying all your dinners. So a word to the wise, follow the rules, don't try and push it. It's very easy in today's electronic age for the IRS to determine if you've gone over those thresholds. But I think this is a huge planning opportunity, here in your marketplace to take advantage of vacation homes, because you have so many of them being held for investment. Go to advance the next slide here. Fractional ownership, this is something called a DST or a TIC. This is a larger commercial building where you have a bunch of co-owners. These are sold as a security under the SEC rules, but they qualify for an exchange. So to get into these, you have to first be an accredited investor, meet those requirements. The big advantage of these is that you're a relatively passive owner. Somebody else is going to manage the property. They're going to have long-term tenants. They take care of all the management responsibilities. The risks, at the end of the day, you're still buying a piece of real estate. If you need to get a new tenant, you may have a capital call to do TIs. You may not like the leases, or they may be great leases. So you still want to evaluate this like you would any other type of real estate. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Going into the next one after that. This was what I talked about 10 minutes ago, about that time period. It is not the matter of time, it's the intent. So the IRS is going to look at provable things. They're going to look at objective things that either support the intent to hold for investment or they contradict it. So here's an example. Let's say I intended this morning to eat healthy. And let's say my breakfast, I drove by McDonald's and I got 3 Egg McMuffins. what was my, well, my intent was one thing, but the IRS is going to look at what I actually did. Same things when you hold real estate. They're going to look at, do you have factors to support that it was held for investment or not? And in a perfect world, you'd have a lot of factors that help support that intent to hold for investment. So what I want to do now, if you can advance the next slide, I want to get into what we call the exchange equation. And this is going to show you very simply, what do you need to do in an exchange to get 100% tax deferral? So go ahead and advance the one slide there, Rebecca. Number one, you want to reinvest all of the net proceeds. Those of you that are real estate professionals, it's after your commission and all the title company fees. So number one, reinvest all net proceeds. Two, you want to acquire property with the same or a greater amount of debt. So if I have a property with a $200,000 mortgage, I want $200,000 or more when I'm buying. If you get cash out, we've already talked about that. That's called cash boot, and that's taxable. If you go down in mortgage and you don't offset it by adding new cash, that's called mortgage boot. That's also taxable. So go ahead here and advance the one slide. Let's look at this example. I'm selling for $900,000, $300,000 of debt, closing cost of $60,000, leaving net equity of $540,000. Go back one slide if you would, Rebecca. In this example here, we go up in value to $1.2 million. The mortgage goes up, so there's no mortgage boot, and I reinvest all the cash. So this very simply is 100% tax deferral. You guys don't have to worry about things like calculating your basis or your net adjusted basis. If you want 100% tax deferral, just reinvest all of the net proceeds, have the same or a greater amount of mortgage, and you can do that on one property, or you can split it out on several properties. That's all you need to do. Makes it very easy. Now go to the next slide. This is one with some boot. The taxpayer goes from $300,000 debt down to $260,000, leaving them with $40,000 mortgage boot. They put $100,000 into their pocket. We add the mortgage boot to the cash boot, and we have $140,000 that's boot. And one thing to be aware of, boot is generally taxable to the extent that you have a capital gain tax consequence. But some CPAs may want their clients to take some boot. Sometimes they've got a lot of carry forward losses that can offset the boot. So boot is generally taxable, but not always. Let me just take a quick break in this segment and just say, are there questions about the exchange equation and what you have to do for 100% tax deferral? Any questions on that topic? All right, go ahead and advance it, Rebecca. Let's get into the mechanics. So there are a lot of ways to do an exchange. Very few people swap. Three-party format was validated back in '63, doesn't happen. Today, about 98% of all exchanges are a delayed exchange with a qualified intermediary. So I want to walk you through and get you really comfortable with the mechanics of how to complete a delayed exchange, what the time deadlines are, and what you have to do. I'll get into a slide later where I talk about the reverse improvement and reverse improvement. Those are much, much more complex. Most everybody does a delay. So go ahead and advance the slide. I want to walk you through here. Go ahead and advance the one. Up at the top is the taxpayer, the real estate investor. Here's what they're going to do. List the property. Once it's under contract, they're going to contact a qualified intermediary. And that qualified intermediary is to prepare some paperwork and to step in the shoes as the seller. Go ahead and advance it there, Rebecca. The title will go directly from the investor to the buyer. Go ahead and advance it one more time. And then the money will go to the qualified intermediary. So the qualified intermediary actually sells the property being sold. They step into the shoes as the seller and sell it, and they get the money. And then go ahead and advance it, Rebecca. They take the money they're holding, they buy a replacement property, go ahead and advance it two more times, and then that property is deeded back to the investor. So when you look at a basic exchange, the QI sells, the qualified intermediary buys, the taxpayer is just giving up title and receiving title. Now, when we look at the time deadline at the bottom, day zero happens when you close. It's not when you sign your contract. That's the closing date. So you'll see you've got 45 days to identify property that you want to buy. Go ahead and advance this slide there, Rebecca. one more time. 45 days, so there are 45 calendar days, and it ends at midnight of the 45th day. Then you have another 135 days for a maximum of 180 to close on what you've identified. And keep in mind, if you're closing near the end of the year and you file your tax return on the April 15th, you could shorten your time period to the date your tax return is due. So just be very aware of that issue. So the first period is called the identification period. It's 0, 45 days, midnight, and then another 135 ending at 6 months. And by the way, these are statutory. You don't have wiggle room on these. There was a little bit with COVID where there was an exception made. And if you're in a presidentially declared disaster area, for example, you have a hurricane come through, you might be eligible, but it's only for people in an affected county. So for the vast part of the country, an exception like that is not going to apply. So close, identify, and then purchase one of the properties identified. You can identify on day 5 3 properties, and then you can revoke them before day 45 and substitute with more. But you have to close on what's been identified within that 45-day window. You can't, after the fact, shoehorn in a property. So that's where the time pressure comes. And just from a practical perspective, the title of this is How to Complete an Exchange. So I want to help you out with the real world on this. When you list your property, and let's just say you're listing it at the right price, you know what the market is, you'll get it under contract in a reasonable period of time. The moment you list, start looking for your replacement property. And that helps take some of the time pressure out of the exchange process. Start looking right away. Where people get in trouble is they close, and they're that exchange period, and they're lollygagging, and all of a sudden they're down to the last week saying, oh no, I got to really scramble here. So try to get ahead of it. As soon as you list the property being sold, start looking for what you want to buy. I did exchange 2 years ago out of Arizona. I didn't even sell my property in Arizona. This was when the market was hot, until I lined up my purchase properties was under contract, because I knew I could sell it in a matter of days. Like, it sold in 24 hours. I knew I could do that. So I focused my attention on the purchase. And I know that sounds counterintuitive. You're excited to get a good price, but you really want an exchange, put all your energy onto the purchase side of things. So now it comes up, well, we've got these identification requirements. Go ahead and advance it, Rebecca. How do we identify? Well, we've got 3 different rules. The most common one is known as the 3 property rule. So you can identify 3 properties of any fair market value, but you're limited to 3. So if I sell for $200,000, identify one at $300,000, one at $500,000, one at $2 million. But I'm limited to 3, but the value is unlimited. So that's the first one. The next one is known as the 200% rule. I can identify as many properties as I want, but no more than twice the value of what I sold. So if I sell for $200,000, I can't go over $400,000. So the first one's a limited number, but an unlimited value. The second one is an unlimited number, but now the value's capped. Does that make sense? They're kind of mirror images, and you've got to fit into one of these 3 rules. There is one exception there called the 95%, which says you identify more than 3 and over 200%, then you've actually got to close on 95% of the value of the properties that have been identified, which really means you got to close on everything. So go ahead and advance to the next one. People ask, well, how do I identify? We're going to provide a form for you to do that on. It's got to be done in writing. And here's the key thing. The second bullet point is critical. You must unambiguously describe the property. If you're going to buy a condo on the beach, you're not buying a 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo. You got to buy unit 34 or unit 67, specific units. If you're going to get a parcel of land, you want to identify by the assessor's parcel number. If you're going to go into fractional ownership, you want to show the fractional ownership that you're going in. So in writing, signed the data by the taxpayer, unambiguously described, and then sent in by midnight of the 45th day. Generally, that'll go to the qualified intermediary. That's generally where that'll go. So those are the identification rules. This is how you do it. And by the way, if you look at the third bullet point, I bet you nobody knows what the word telecopied means. I barely know what it means. It really is referring to remember the old thin thermal fax paper that we get all curly Q? Those of you who have been around a while, that's what telecopied is. So what's interesting, here's my iPhone, right? When these rules came out from the IRS, they came out in 1990. We didn't have smartphones. We didn't have email being used like we do today, right? Today, everything's electronic. It wasn't. So the rules say telecopy. So a lot of people ask, well, what about email? What I would recommend you do is write on a piece of paper, sign it, date it, sign it, scan it in as a PDF image, and then you can email that over to your qualified intermediary. I wouldn't recommend using Microsoft Outlook right now because until we get to the point where we've got digital signatures that identify us, how do we know that you signed and dated it? We really don't. So I think a PDF is a good one. And let me give you a pro tip. I want to make this practical. Pro tip is when you send it over to the qualified intermediary, have them confirm receipt and then keep verification of that. If for some reason you get audited and you need proof that you're identified, now you have proof from the qualified intermediary. And I also bring that up because years ago when we had the big downturn after 2007, about 75% of all qualified intermediaries went out of business. If you work with a small company that shut its doors, who do you have backing you in an audit? So you should keep it on your end so you've got that as well. That would just be my input. Go ahead and advance to the next one. So let me go through the highlights, and I just want to circle back here so we're all clear. Number one, before you close, consult with your tax advisor and a knowledgeable qualified intermediary. Number two, make sure that contract is an assignable contract. This is really important. You must have the ability to assign the contract. I can provide you with a clause. In fact, I think I have in the presentation with suggested wording. And then go to the next slide. Then next, you want to set up your exchange and have the documents in place prior to closing. You can't set up an exchange after you close. It's got to be set up prior to closing. Then you've got to identify replacement property within the 45-day identification period in accordance with the rules of identification. Then you have a maximum of 180 days to close on property identified. If for some reason you don't close on it or don't buy the property, then you just end up paying taxes and a taxable sale. That's kind of the opposite, kind of what happened. Yeah, Brittany, Rebecca's got this, and I'm assuming she'll share that. This information is available to be shared, absolutely. So happy to do that. Go into the next slide there, Rebecca. Okay, this is the clause that we suggest when you're selling a property. Now, those of you that are real estate professionals, your broker might have other language. Use whatever your broker likes. But this is some boilerplate language. And then I'm going to advance that for Rebecca, the next one. This is when selling, and this is boilerplate language when you're buying a replacement property. Wow, Brittany. So Brittany said she was not aware of the 200% rule. She's in a 1031 now, and nobody told her. Well, Brittany, I'm glad you came today, and I was able to add some value and give you some more options on that. Rebecca, go ahead and advance it from there. Okay, go ahead and pull this one. Yeah, here we go. There's some things you don't want to do in exchange. You've got to follow the rules. So an exchange is what I call statutory. It's not optional. You either follow the rules and you get tax deferral, or you don't follow the rules and you pay the taxes. The one that I want to touch on is that third bullet point. The Dobricks backdated their identification. So they found something like after day 45, they lied and committed tax fraud. They actually colluded with their intermediary in the tax fraud. They all got audited. Here's what happened to Mr. Dobrich. He found out that he cheated and lied. They hit him with his full capital gain taxes, $2.2 million in taxes. He got hit with an additional $1.6 million fraud penalty, a 75% fraud penalty, and then interest on top of that. And I just share that with you to say you can do a lot with exchanges, but stay within the rules, do it properly, and be smart and plan ahead. You don't want to do things like backdating your identification or anything like that. Go ahead, the next one, Rebecca. Okay, can you do an exchange at the very last minute? The closing table, 31st of July, absolutely. Stop the closing, Contact a qualified intermediary right away. Go ahead and advance the next one. The intermediary will get documents over to your closing officer, and a good intermediary can do this within an hour's notice if necessary. Now, I don't want to speak for the whole industry, but we can easily, within an hour or so, get the documents in place. So you can always convert a taxable sale and make it a 1031 exchange up until you close. Once you close, it then becomes a taxable sale. There's no way to unwind that at that particular point in time. Go ahead and advance the next one here. This is what an intermediary will prepare: exchange agreement, assignment agreement, notice of assignment, some forms to set up the account, and then detailed instructions for the closing officer. Probably the most important thing you want to ask when you're selecting a qualified intermediary is, how are the funds secure? What security mechanisms do you have? And I'll touch upon this later, but they're holding your money during that period of time. Go ahead on the next slide. I want to walk through. So sometimes people want to consolidate. So this is an example of one investor selling 3 smaller properties and rolling them into a larger property. Let's say you're selling 3 single-family homes and you're going to roll that into an 8-plex or a commercial property. So go ahead and advance here, Rebecca. This is selling. Go ahead and hit it again. The money goes to the qualified intermediary. Go ahead and again. The intermediary buys 1 replacement property, 1 more advance, 1 more. There you go. And then deeds it back. So on paper, let's go back the other one. On the selling multiple looks pretty easy. The thing to keep in mind is you're selling 3 properties. Whenever the first property closes, that's going to start the time deadline for properties 2 and 3. So here's a pro tip for you. Get property number 1 under contract, but push back the closing date. With properties 2 and 3, drop the sales price a little bit to get them under contract. So you as a seller control when you're going to sell. There is a way to structure this, but it's going to require being a little proactive on your part of it there. So Rebecca, advance the next slide. This one's a little more common one. Go ahead and advance it. Taxpayer sells 1 property to buyer. Go ahead and advance it. Money comes to qualified intermediary. We then take that and we buy multiple replacement properties, 1 more advance, and then we deed each one of those properties back to the taxpayer. So our average client's going to sell 1, and they're going to buy 1, 2, or 3. They're going to diversify, either buy bigger property or buy multiple. But this is a very common format. Let me just do a quick pause. I've been talking for a while. Are there questions about the delayed exchange? Because that's kind of the meat and potatoes of what a typical exchange looks like.
I have a quick clarification question on the 200%. So, I mean, say you're going to buy something that's bigger, right? You're selling off multiple properties. You're doing the 1031 to buy an apartment complex. Yep. So are you saying that the 200% is based off of the equity that you make? So that's in the escrow account. It can't be more than 200% of that, or is it 200% of your sell price?
Yeah, the 200% is just the sales price of what you're selling. If you're selling for $1 million, you can identify up to $2 million, and it's the gross sales price. It's just what you're selling for. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I assume, because I know you have to use all of your equity. So if you have enough equity to purchase multiple properties, it just has to fall under that 200% valuation.
Correct. Now, there's that one exception, right, where you can, that rarely happens. Now, I'll tell you that exception. I've personally done it. I sold a piece of dirt. I went into 5 single family, and I had to use a 95% rule. So there are 3 different ways to identify. 3 properties, any value. That one's super easy. That's the most common. 200% is as many as you want, but no more than twice your sales price. And then number 3, you can identify more than 3 and more than 200, but you have to close on essentially everything, right? 95%, which in practical terms means you got to buy everything you've identified. So those are the 3 rules there. And Brittany, if I've got my contact information and I've got a 1-page summary of the identification rules. I'd be more than happy to send that over to you if you'd just like to see a little bit more on that. I can ask in any others. On, let's say, the delayed exchange. Any questions on the delayed exchange?
May I ask a question?
Sure.
You said that there is language that needs to go into the sales contract where either buyer or seller has to acknowledge that this contract is involved in a 1031 exchange, and you had a slide that said this is the suggested language.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something I could Google and get, or is that something I should ask my attorney for?
You know, a great question. I think our language covers all the bases. I didn't go into my background because it was all echoey at the beginning. I've been doing 1031 since 1988. I'm the former president of the Trade Association, and I'm actively involved in DC educating people in Congress. I met with 60 people in Congress last year on this exact subject. So I'm fairly knowledgeable, and I've written hundreds of articles, blah, blah, blah. What you can do is look at the language that I have in the PowerPoint. I think that covers the basis. You can ask an attorney to do that, and no disrespect to attorneys. A lot of my friends are attorneys, but an attorney can say the same language in probably 2 pages of text, right? They can put there you go. This is the bare bones. So if you look at the language, seller is aware the buyer intends to form exchange. Buyer requests a cooperation and agrees to hold the party hold harmless. They agree to an assignment of the contract. In fact, Cindy, I'm going to go one step further. You don't have to have this language in your contract. So I want to be really clear on that. Your contract must be an assignable contract. That's the key thing. There's nothing that prohibits assignability. As long as the contract can be assigned, we can do an exchange. I think as a good business practice, including this as an addendum to your contract, it makes it really clear to the IRS and to all parties that you're doing an exchange. So I personally use this and do this when I sell properties. You don't necessarily have to have it on the purchase side. So I'm assuming most of you are agents or investors. You don't want to give the seller any leverage, right, to know that you're under the gun time-wise. So I'm fairly liberal using it when I sell, but I may not disclose this to the seller when I'm buying, because I don't want them to know that I'm under a time deadline and that I identified their one property, and now we come to the home inspection and we're struggling to get to the middle ground. I don't want them to know they have leverage, that I have to take the deal one way or the other. So that's just a practical tip there.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, happy to do that. I just wanted to kind of pause a little bit. Delayed, or what you're most going to do, you can advance it here a few slides, Rebecca.
May I ask one last question on the delayed?
You can even ask 2.
Okay. My situation is I have one investment property and one primary residence, and I want to sell both of them and buy something else. Is that deferrable or not?
Cindy, it's a great question, and believe it or not, I have 5 or 6 slides on that exact issue. So,
okay, so I'll pipe down.
Well, let me just give you a simple answer. In the 1031, you can do that. What I would recommend, how much gain do you have in your primary residence?
200.
How much?
200,000.
Are you 200,000? Whether you're single or married, your primary residence tax exclusion will eat up that gain. So you're fine. You can just sell it, take the 121 exclusion, and you'll be ahead. So you don't need to do any other strategy. Does that
Even
make
if
sense?
I already took that lifetime thing when I got divorced?
It's not lifetime anymore. So what they did, the old code was section 1034. They changed the code back in 1997 to section 121. And Cindy, believe it or not, I've got about 5 slides on this exact issue. So give me a moment. I'm going to go through a couple other topics, and then we're going to jump into this, because so many people want to move into a rental property, or they want to convert their residence to a rental. And I've got some slides that address that. So let me just tell you, before I get into that topic, and I think, Cindy, it'll address your questions. If it doesn't, I'll circle back with you. There are these creative variations. So a reverse is when I buy the new property before I sell the existing, right? So it's a flip order. That's when you've got a really tight market or a property you really want. An improvement is when I'm going to improve a property or maybe build from the ground up something that's to my specifications. In a reverse improvement, I buy the dirt, and then I improve the property, and then I have 180 days. Now, I don't go into these in detail, and I'll tell you why. These are way, way more complex. We do a normal exchange for like $1,250. These start at $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. They're considerably more complex. So a lot of commercial investors do them. There are a lot more moving parts, and I won't get into all the complexities, but these are also other exchange strategies that are available in the marketplace. So I just want to mention that. Now go to the next slide here. And what I want to do is talk about, I got two more concepts, and then we'll kind of have a wide open. My goal today was to make sure you knew how to complete a basic delayed exchange, what the rules and the time processes were with that, and just to make you comfortable. So 1031 is tax deferral with investment property. 121 is tax exclusion when you live in a property 2 out of 5 years. So they're separate tax codes. One's for investment, 1031. 121 is for primary. Go to the next slide. What I want to cover are scenarios 3, 4, and 5. What I call a split treatment. So a split treatment, my house where I'm speaking to you from, my entire basement is my office. So where I am right now, this is my son's old bedroom in the basement. I put all these lighting and got it all set up for doing Zooms and things like this. And then the rest of my basement is an office where I manage my property, and my daughter works for me part-time tracking my rents. When I sell my home, my entire basement, I'll do a 1031 exchange out of my basement because I use it 100% for business. There's no personal use at all now. It's all business. People do Airbnb. Sometimes people have a duplex where they live in one unit and rent out another. So that's what split treatment is. And then we'll talk about converting a rental property you go into that you want to make your residence. What if you exchange it to a property on a golf course in Charlotte? And it's a beautiful golf course and you later want to move into it. You can do that. And then finally, converting a rental, a residence into a rental. So go to advance 2 slides if you could, Rebecca. So just go back 1. So let me just do a quick recap. 121 says you have to live in the property 2 years out of 5. If you're single, you get to exclude 250 in gain, married $500,000. And a little caveat for everybody, right now in Congress, they're looking to increase these thresholds. So these came about in 97. Properties have gone up a lot since 1997. So they're trying to double it, make it $500,000 and $1 million. So that's not law yet, but NAR is lobbying for that. Go ahead to the next slide there. What you're going to do when you've got a split treatment is you're going to need to get your tax advisor involved. If you do Airbnb, your tax advisor is going to have to determine how many feet are allocated towards Airbnb, how many towards your residence. So they're going to come up with the allocation. The portion that is investment goes to the qualified intermediary, and the portion you live in goes to you. So let me give you a simple, go to the next slide. Here's an easy visual. You have a 4-unit, a 4-plex. You live in 1 unit for 2 years, you rent the other 3. At the sale, 25% goes to you, and you take advantage of the 121 tax exclusion. 3 of the units go to a qualified intermediary. So it's 1 sale to 1 buyer, but you're using 2 different tax code sections. Does that make sense? So you can use with a 4-plex, duplex, triplex, a rental unit underneath your property. If you have a mother-in-law unit on a detached garage that you rent to a college kid, that's a rental property, even though you have your main residence. We're seeing them now with accessory dwelling units, ADUs, where people are bringing an ADU onto their property. So I think in the next 10 years, you're going to see the zoning change to allow for ADUs because I won't go off on a soapbox, but we're 4 to 6 million housing units underserved nationally. We need, about 5 million homes just to meet current demand. There's no way home builders are going to meet the demand. So things like ADUs are a way to create some capacity on existing parcels. And it's a win-win for everybody, right? People get into housing. You as a homeowner get a tenant on your property. So it's kind of a cool deal. Go to the next slide. There are different ways to do this. If you've got a farm or a ranch, here's a $4.6 million ranch with a $600,000 house. You sell the house under 121, you do an exchange on all $4 million of dirt. Go ahead and advance it. Airbnb, $1 million home. You Airbnb a room or 2 and a bathroom. The portion your Airbnb is 1031, your residence is 121. Go ahead, advance it. This one's my exact house. My house is worth 750. My basement is all of a business office, and I live on the main floor and the upper floor. So when I sell it, 1/3 of it I'll exchange, and then 2/3 of it will be 121. Go ahead and advance it one more. The next one that comes up is somebody wants to convert a rental property into a residence. So you can do this, but there's a 5-year holding period, and you only get the 121 exclusion for the amount of time you live in it over the total ownership period. So go to the next slide there, Rebecca. Somebody does an exchange and they rent it out for 3 years. After 3 years are up, they change their mind, decide they want to move into it. They live there for 5. So they're over the 5-year threshold. They get 5/8 of their 121 exclusion because they lived in it 5 years, even though the total ownership was 8 years. But this is a popular strategy. And let me go to the very last one. Cindy, this works for people that have a lot of gain in the residence. So go to the next slide there, Rebecca. You can convert your home into a rental property. So I move out of my residence and I rent it for a year. Well, I still live there 2 out of the 5 years. So I get my 121 exclusion, and then I do an exchange on it. So let's just say, north of you guys, let's just say you're in the Hamptons, the west end of Long Island. Those properties are what, 5, 10, let's just say 10 million. What if that was your home and all your equities in your really nice property in the Hamptons? You move out of it and then you do a 1031 exchange and you buy single family rentals in Charlotte. You could pick up 40 single family rentals all out of the equity in your primary residence. So this strategy here is really good for people that have a lot of equity in their home where they've gone up a lot. And now they can convert the equity in their home into capital that goes into a cash flowing investment property. So I just wanted to talk to you. You can 1031, you can convert it into a rental. You could have a rental, you can convert it into 1031. You could do the house. You guys have heard the term, I'm sure, house hacking, right? We have tenants. If I house hack and rent out rooms, those rooms I rent out are 1031. So there are a lot of variations. And I think the explosion of Airbnb has opened up a whole new opportunities here. Go on to the next slide. Whenever you do an exchange, this is the form you're going to fill out and send to the IRS. It's called 8824, like kind exchange. And you've got to represent when you identified property, when you bought it. If you lie on this form, it's tax fraud. So don't lie on the form. What hopefully I'm showing you is 1031s are very straightforward. It's a very, very simple process. You follow the rules and you get 100% tax deferral and you build a lot of wealth in real estate, right? I'm assuming most of you are investors. You increase, the person that exchanges gets this much more real estate versus the person who sells and pays taxes along the way. Coming down home stretch, go to the next slide. You are actually turning over your equity to somebody else, right? The qualified intermediary is going to hold your funds. And so the most important thing is to do due diligence on who you're going to have as your qualified intermediary. They're holding your money. And there have been some significant bankruptcies. I won't go through them all, but there have been, 100 million here, 130 million, 420 million. There are a lot of excellent companies, but I want to give you some things to look at. So Rebecca, advance there if you would. A big one would be, is that QI, is it a subsidiary of a big parent company? There are banks that have qualified intermediaries, and most of the major title insurance companies also have qualified intermediaries. So our parent company is Stewart Title, in a business for 127, 128 years. They stand behind the money. So if you're working with somebody who's a subsidiary of a big parent, you're going to get a lot more security. You obviously want to look at the financial rating and balance sheet, and then look at where the money goes. I'm sure we all remember just a few months ago, right? We had the run on Silicon Valley Bank. We had Signature Bank, Credit Suisse. There were some major banking problems. You don't want to have your money necessarily in a really small local community bank. I think you're much better off working with a big company that's going to put the money in a very big financial institution, one of the big top 10 firms. On the next slide, if you advance to that, Rebecca, the number one thing you want to have is the very first bullet point there. how are those funds secured? Is it a separate, segregated account? So you want money to go into your very own account, require your signature to set it up and your signature to pull it out. All of the bankruptcies where people have been affected involves commingled accounts. It was data entry. So a commingled account is not what I recommend. You want your own separate, segregated account for you and your client. Put money into it and it requires your signature to pull money out of it. You can certainly set up a qualified escrow or trust account. There's generally an added fee. And certainly you want to do due diligence on the company. You know, do they have sufficient fidelity bond coverage? But making sure it's a segregated account, that one to me, it's not on the slide. I'm going to leave you guys with a great resource. Our industry trade association, it's a mouthful. It's called the Federation of Exchange Accommodators. I don't know why it's so lengthy, but their website is an easy one to remember. It's 1031.org. So 1031.org. Companies that belong to the FEA, and our company, Asset Preservation, does, they have subscribed to a code of ethics and ways that they will hold the money in an exchange. So that might be a decent resource to find out potential qualified intermediaries. Go ahead and advance and clear, Rebecca. And by the way, I went a tad faster because that echo, I'm glad the echo went away. This is us. We're all over on social media. I'm always posting stuff. If you go to the next slide, you know, look at it as a qualified intermediary, as a resource to help you. You guys are all in the Charlotte market. I work all over the country. We've got an office in New York that works in the Eastern time zone. So our Eastern Regional Office, the best one for you is that 866-394-1031. The bottom email, you might want to take just a screenshot of this or write them down, info@API Exchange. The president of the company, Javier Vandesteeg, myself, and a few others are on that email. If you have a question, send it on over. We spend 90% of our day just answering questions for people about exchanges. So we know the rules and the processes very well. We've done hundreds of thousands of these. Now, we don't replace your tax advisor at all, right? So your tax advisor is critical. They know your individual tax situation, but we can certainly come alongside them and provide a lot of input and guidance on the process. And then on the very last slide here, Rebecca, that's my contact information, 888-531-1031. I'm in Colorado, but I'm pretty accessible pretty much any time. Michelle, I believe, Rebecca, you're going to share the PowerPoint with everybody?
Yes.
All right, we're doing that. So now I wanted to get through the content, and I know I went pretty fast. Hopefully you guys got the mechanics, and now you know how to complete an exchange, what's involved. But any question you want to ask me, the floor is open.
Back when you were saying that you can get the qualified intermediary done in like an hour if you needed to, what would you have to do? Because I've had 2 transactions where last minute, right before closing, they were like, "Oh, I think I want to hold the funds in a 1031, and you just need to do an addendum." They didn't end up doing it, but you just need to do an addendum so the seller understands the intent and make sure the contract is assignable.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer 2 things you brought up there, Stephanie. Number one, as long as the contract doesn't prohibit assignability. So I'm in Colorado. Our state contract prohibits assignability. So every state's a little different. So I'm always sensitive when I'm speaking to other regions. If your contract allows it for it to be assigned, it doesn't prohibit it. By default, you can assign around them. So they can't stop an exchange. A buyer cannot prevent your client as a seller from doing an exchange. So I don't think you even need the language in the contract. I just would set it up. To set it up, you need a number. You need to call a qualified intermediary. They're going to need your contract, your title work, and then your client's name, phone number, and address. We can do it. We can do it within an hour or less. Most companies can do it in a few hours. So as long as you have all those things accessible, we can quickly convert a taxable sale into a 1031.
That's great to know. Thank you.
All right. I see a hand there with Montfort. Fire away there.
Hey, thanks. We just had a question. We hold a property in an LLC, and like you said, you have to relinquish and purchase in the same name. Since we'll likely be getting a loan in our personal name, how do you make sure that exchange happens properly? Do you just immediately quitclaim deed it to the LLC?
Yeah. So when you say an LLC, everybody thinks of an LLC as one thing. LLCs can be all sorts of things. They can be regarded entities. They can be disregarded. They could even be S corps. Most LLCs and investors use are disregarded entities, meaning the taxes are going to flow through to your personal tax return. It's not a separate partnership tax return. In that case, it's the same tax owner selling and buying. So if I sell in my name and I buy in an LLC, as long as it's a disregarded LLC and I'm the member of it, it's the same entity. So it sounds to me like you've got multiple entities on your partnership.
No, it's just our personal. It's a pass through, so that would make sense. That would what you said.
Then you're good. Now, I always recommend holding title in the LLC just for liability protection. You want to do that. If you get sued, you want the LLC sued, not me personally. And I'm an investor. Just a couple planning tips. Number one, when you do that, set up a separate bank account. Have all the money go in and out of the bank account. Number two, treat it like a business. Have annual meetings. Have a meeting minutes. Document it. Where people get killed on LLCs is you set up an LLC, but you don't run it like a business. And they sue you, and you say, "Oh, I have an LLC," and then they find out you can run it like a business. So, remember, I'm an investor and I'm a 1031 guy. Run your LLC like a business. Do those things, and that'll help protect you quite a bit.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah. Other questions? Cindy, did I answer yours? Are you pretty clear now on the home? Good. It was a great question. It was like a cue up for my topic. Thank you. Is everybody clear on the time deadlines and the process forward on how to do that? You'll get the PowerPoint, which will help you kind of a cheat sheet, but anything qualifies as like-kind. It's very, very simple. As investors, I'll go out on a limb and say you're crazy to pay the taxes, crazy. Unless you're near retirement and you want to get out of real estate, right? There's a time and a place. You might want to say, hey, I'm done with real estate. I'll pay it and take my money off the table. But everybody that's building a real estate portfolio, growing it, to me makes very little sense to pay all those taxes when you're going to go out and buy another investment property. So 1031s are a powerful tool to grow and scale your portfolio.
Well, we are certainly grateful that you shared all of this great information with us. And having you on here is absolutely a treat. And I learned some extra things that I didn't know. And I'll probably be calling you tomorrow because I do have a property under contract right now. I think everybody, especially if you're watching this back, make sure that you connect with Scott. Definitely a great company to work with.
Correct. I appreciate that. And you guys, I'm happy to talk. You don't have to have a deal. If you just want to kick around, hey, I'm thinking of structuring this, Javier, myself, and all the senior people, we spend all our day just talking to people. And we're really, really good at the 1031 niche. You want to understand your marketplace. So you might be working with a realtor who knows the market. So we'll answer all the 1031 tax questions. And then maybe you're working with another professional on the market questions. But we love helping people out. The part that bums us out is people go, oh, I just closed 2 days ago and I didn't set it up. So engage your tax advisor for sure. They know your tax situation. Talk to a good intermediary. We can be a great resource. My contact information's there. I am in Denver. I'm not in Charlotte. My brother lives in North Carolina. Maybe that qualifies a little bit. He moved from California. He's one of those transplants. But I work with people all over the country. I'm happy to talk to you on the phone or email, or even if you want to set up a Zoom or FaceTime call with clients, whatever it is, happy to be a resource. Rebecca, thanks for setting this up. Sorry we got a little wonky there, but I'm glad we got it all figured out.
We did. Thanks everyone for your patience, and we will see you at the next grid.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.
Hey, Rebecca, how will we get the PowerPoint slides?
If you registered, which you did, We will send that out with all of the videos after, probably tomorrow.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.